Hey everyone, my name is Charlie, and today I thought I would share a few readings from my latest book, An Heir to Murder. Please excuse the unfinished copy. The finished copies are all either downstairs or in boxes, and I'm not about to go and find them. An Heir to Murder was released in February and is my first foray into cosy crime. It follows the character of Alice Valentine after she is sacked from her job and her auntie dies. She discovers she's actually inherited a house in Partridge Mews, somewhere she's never really wanted to return to because of backbiting, and if you've read the Doris books then you know what I am talking about. Upon moving into this cottage, she finds her next door neighbour, retired detective Arthur Sterling, has been murdered, and thus finds herself embroiled in the investigation. You know, just so she has a bit of something to do. Please excuse my dog snoring in the background. He's hopefully going to provide something of a soundtrack to these proceedings. I wanted to do this for a few reasons. One is that I've had quite a few events cancelled now, and events that were in the pipeline now are not going to be happening, and I respect that entirely. And also because I thought it might be a bit entertaining for you to see the very many faces that I do whilst I am reading from my books. Alice Valentine came about because I had been trying to write a cosy crime series for years, and I couldn't figure out how to do this book. I was reading Writing magazine, and a writer was talking about how they killed off their detective and figured out how to write their story. I was like, yes, that is what I need to do. And so Arthur Sterling was originally going to be a detective in one of these books. Then Alice was a character who didn't necessarily arrive fully formed, but she was there, and I knew that I wanted to do something with her in future. I'd written some dialogue where she was this very sarcastic person who she seemed to be using humour to avoid something, and over time I managed to put her into a book. So I think what I'll do is I'll read the very first passage from the book, from chapter 1, and then I'll just dip in and out here with what I would ordinarily read at a reading. Chapter 1. Alice wished she'd never laid eyes on Mrs. Sylvia Cameron. There had been some mix-up with the paperwork, and as such, rather than spend Thursday afternoons helping the impoverished of Partridge Grove, she found herself assigned to a 93-year-old woman with an acid tongue. It didn't last long. Alice chose to take the high road and signed Sylvia up for a tea dance. Unfortunately, Alice made a mistake that cost her a job, her reputation, and to some extent her fashion sense. She recalled her manager's face at their final meeting. He looked like a bewildered owl as he said, "Can you tell me what was going through your mind when you sent a nonagenarian to a Zumba class, Alice?" She hated meetings. She'd considered blaming her error on the recent death of her Auntie Magdalena, but that felt too dirty, and thus she told him the truth. She said, "I won't lie, I typed in Thursday tea dance and booked the first thing I saw. I never thought Google would go with key words over common sense." Alice had never seen someone so disappointed in her, and she once had to tell a boy that French kissing didn't involve pain au chocolat. Her manager, Keith, straightened his tie, coughed a cough that sounded as though he were checking the strength of his own prostate, and said to Alice, "I have to say, I thought you could have made something of yourself here. Instead, you've allowed one mistake to ruin your entire career." She couldn't help herself. She felt the old glimmer of mischief catch in her throat like a hastily swallowed pear drop. Before she could stop herself, she said, "You're the one ruining my career, Keith. You could have put me under supervision, demoted me, left me making coffee for Mary Hines with the prosthetic leg, but instead you're allowing this smear campaign by Mrs. Cameron's family to decide for you. You've about as much integrity as gluten-free bread." It was a Zumba class. Many older women enjoy Zumba. At 93? There's no upper age limit. They don't discriminate. She died. Well, is it really that much of a loss? Keith gave her until 3 o'clock to clear out her things. Not that she had many. She could have broken all manner of data protection laws, stolen client details and sold them off to cold callers. She didn't. She didn't even take her mug because when she got to the kitchen, Mary Hines was using it, and Alice wasn't sure she could take something from a woman who lost her leg on an exercise bike. Instead, Alice left with just her coat and handbag and a few dozen paper clips, a stapler, an ergonomic keyboard, and the keys to Keith's Mazda. Keys she helpfully dropped down the nearest grid. And that is our first introduction to Alice. As I say, I'm aware that in that bit there, I just ended up being mildly Liverpudlian. This isn't the first time it happened. Whenever I try to do dialogue after I've had a cold, I end up sounding Liverpudlian. What I'm going to do now is I am going to move along to Alice discovering the body. And this comes after Alice ends up working with another one of these former detectives who was caring for Alice's auntie's house. And his name is Marmaduke Featherstone. And he is a friend of the victims. However, Alice and Marmaduke don't get on in the beginning of this book. As with any relationship that we see happen, you know, it's not the first time we've seen it. I'm not going to pretend that. But Marmaduke sends someone to Alice's house. And after this encounter, she decides she's going to go and give him a piece of her mind. On the way there, though, she notices something. And that's where this next part comes from. Alice strode out. Her footsteps crunched against the stones. She moved with such anger that should so much as a millimetre of gravel slip into her shoes, she'd tear up the path and replace it with a moat. Marmaduke Featherstone was fast becoming a thorn in her side. Not only had he made Auntie Magdalena's cottage look as though it belonged on an episode of Hoarders, but also he'd chosen to make the move as difficult as he possibly could. She stormed up the road and froze, stopped stock still. She wasn't sure why it caught her eye, but she looked up anyhow. Mr. Sterling's door was open, ajar even, as though someone wanted to close the door but couldn't quite figure it out. Thoughts of his recent arguments ran through Alice's mind. She edged towards his gate, uneasiness causing the hairs on the back of her neck to twitch. Alice couldn't understand the sense of something not quite being right. It made no sense how alert her mind became, how each crunch of her soul against gravel sounded like a landmine, how each flower petal wanted to be a gun or a gloved hand, some masked assailant waiting in the shadows. The front door creaked as she pushed it open. Her palms were as sweaty as they'd been on GCSE results day. The living room curtains were drawn, leaving the place in darkness, a blue hue cast over everything. "Mr. Sterling?" Alice called, voice quaking. She caught sight of his hair first, a thatch of white straw rising from the armchair. "Mr. Sterling?" Alice held her breath and listened intently. The room remained silent. She prayed for the sound of his heavy breathing, the guttural snoring of an old man. Nothing. Perhaps he was a light sleeper. No, he wasn't. There was too much blood. Alice noticed the thick clods of blood staining the mantelpiece first. It coated the picture frames and the table beside him, just missing the trilby on the floor. She held back her screaming and made her way over to stand in front of him. His mouth hung open, blue eyes void and staring at nothing in particular. Arthur Sterling was dead. And obviously, you know, that's me trying to be as dramatic as I possibly could, because quite honestly, this book, whilst it being a cosy crime novel, and that is probably the most sort of gore we're going to see in this series as we go on, it's still supposed to be humorous. And it, you know, this book goes into grief, and it talks about grief because, as we know, my grandmother died whilst I was writing this, so it did impact it in that way. I still wanted to keep it somewhat cozy, but I also didn't want to feel as though I was glossing over anything. Which I suppose is also where my writing of Indisputably Doris came into play with this book, because in that book I chose to be more serious with themes but still keep the book humorous. And so we have these moments in Indisputably Doris that could easily be seen as a character suffering from anxiety or depression. I still managed to make the book funny. So had I not written that book, I probably wouldn't have been able to keep this book still having more serious moments whilst also keeping the humour. Next, I think that I want to share the charity shop scene with you. The reason behind this being that most people know I work at a charity shop, and when I did my launch of this, someone who was in the audience had read that part and asked me to read it because they thought, well, he's got behind the scenes knowledge of how these things work. So I'll have to find it. It does have the mildest bit of gore in it, I'll have to say. I'm just gonna find it now. You think someone would a proper professional writer would have read all this, tabbed out the parts they wanted to read like I ordinarily do before having one of these sessions, but I haven't done. Anyway, this is the same charity shop that features in my radio play, Charity Begins, that features in the second chapter of Indisputably Doris, and is one day hopefully going to have its own novelisation. But one thing I noticed, and I was thinking about earlier, is even though I first started working on the charity shop play in 2011, I never actually aged up the characters, so they've been stuck in this perpetual state of being the same ages for nearly 10 years now. And I didn't think of that before. So if the radio play ever finds its, way out, there's a lot of old references in there now. It's strange how in 10 years references can change so much. But I like to include them. It's a bit of a shared universe type thing, and I like to include like little Easter eggs to other stories and worlds I've created that you may not see, but I know that I'd had a plan with them in the past, and I like to pay homage to those stories. The East Cheshire Relief Fund for the Bewildered Elderly had prime position in the town centre, as did several other charity shops. Since her youth, Alice had seen the chain stores and independent shops close, leaving a whole host of charity shops and restaurants to rise in their place. She'd never really given it much thought until she had to drive to Poynton to buy an outfit for a wedding. At least the place didn't smell like her childhood memories of charity shops, or cigarettes and ammonia. Sure, there was a hint of must in the air that could have been either the antique wardrobe in the middle of the shop, or the gaggle of older ladies gossiping by the pound rail. That always seemed to be a guaranteed staple at charity shops, a gaggle of older ladies gossiping by the pound rail. Older men tended to congregate in libraries and allotments, out of the way and quiet, but the women owned their spot, glared at anyone who sought to get past, dared to eavesdrop. These were also the only women in the shop. Nobody stood at the till guarding the display cabinet full of jewellery. A mass of bric-a-brac sat in the window, unsupervised, fit for the taking. Carlton ware stood beside Russell and Bromley shoes, more expensive than a holiday to Portugal. She understood they were a charity, but even high-class escorts sometimes gave it away on the cheap. Alice had no choice but to approach the women. They surrounded the pound rail like a modern-day coven, all tight perms and Estee Lauder. They, each of them, were the very essence of smart casual, in their M&S tops and pleated trousers, creases so sharp they'd shame an accountant. One of the women, clearly taking charge, took one step forward to greet Alice. She had a false smile stamped against her face, her eyes giving the impression that all customers were unwelcome. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice high-pitched and breathy, like a hoover with a penny caught in its pipe. "I have a carload of bags to donate," Alice said, feeling as though she was facing Partridge Muse's very own answer to Smaug. The woman pursed her lips, the wrinkled spider-webbing around her mouth. "Are you able to carry it all yourself, or should I fetch someone from the back room?" Alice knew the answer immediately. "I can bring them in myself, no bother." The smile again. "Good. Well, I'll just nip through and let them know to expect you." Alice nodded and began the back and forth to her car. She heaved the bags with all the enthusiasm of a pack mule, questioning just why she'd filled the bags so much. She hadn't even looked at some of the stuff, just packed it into the bags and hoped for the best. On her third trip, a man about her age appeared beside her. He was thin, lanky, and looked so unsure of himself that he reminded Alice of a newborn foal. "Can I help at all?" he asked, his voice ropey, each word practically a different pitch. "That'd be great, yeah." He leaned into the car and grabbed a few bags at once. This man clearly appreciated Lynx deodorant. He sprayed himself so liberally that Alice could taste it. As he leaned, his shirt rode up to reveal the waistband of his underwear. Sure, they might have looked like Calvin Klein, but Primark? No wonder he was so unsure of himself. Alice followed him through to the back room to deposit her bags. A squat, dumpy-looking woman had already started sorting her donations. "Found a friend, have we, Martin?" "Just thought I'd help her carry some bags. He's very chivalrous, is our Martin." Alice nodded, then pointed at the door. "There aren't many more. I can bring them myself." She sped away before she heard the woman's next comment, but it was enough to elicit a give-over Bev from Martin. She thought she'd shook him off, left the weird charity shop people to their own devices, but Martin came to the side of her car again moments later. "Sorry about that," he said, running a hand through his shaggy hair, looking like some sort of dishevelled Dulux dog. "It's fine," Alice said. "I just want to—" Bev screamed. A high-pitched wail as theatrical as Les Miserables cut Alice off mid-sentence. Martin flew back inside like a whippet. Alice followed him into the back room alongside the older ladies. Bev stood at the table, holding a large, cracked ornament, somewhat canine in appearance. Sure, it could be seen as scary, but Alice guessed it wasn't the ornament that had caused Bev to wail like a banshee. No, the reason she'd screamed was the dried blood covering the thing, and on the base, what Alice could only assume was brain matter. "Well, that doesn't look good," Alice said. Another reason that I included that is because for years I have talked about how if you wanted to commit a crime, a charity shop would be the best place to dispose of the evidence. And back in the day, this was because our shops at the time didn't have CCTV. We do now. And we didn't have cameras at the back door, and we had like a private car park, so nobody would be in there at night time. So I always said, like, you could leave something on the doorstep, you know, clothes you'd worn to murder somebody, and evidence, just leave it all, and if it's bad it'll get thrown away, and you've disposed of your evidence in an easy way. Alas, alack, and all that. I think it was Carolyn Dudd. Oh, I can't remember what her name is. Carola Dunn, I think her name is. She wrote a mystery series, and in one of her books, Manna from Hades, it starts with someone finding a body in a charity shop. So somebody else had the same idea as me. So another reason that I wanted to have that scene in here is because I needed there to be a reason for Alice to end up embroiled in this crime. And one way to do that was to not just have the guy who is murdered be her next door neighbour, but also have someone try and dispose of the murder weapon in the cottage that she's just inherited, thus turning her new cottage into a bit of a crime scene as well. And so the two merge together. A lot of authorial intent going on here. That's why this book was planned 18 months before I wrote it, so I could kind of iron out any kinks. I'd say that this book is a bit of a straightforward murder mystery. I don't want to give any spoilers, but that's what this one is. I always think about easing readers into situations, and that's what I was trying to do with this book. I'm aware that we haven't had me read any scene with Primrose, and I recently said that Primrose was my favourite character at the moment, simply because she is always looking on the bright side of life, always being a bit more positive. And so I'm going to go right back to the start, and I'm just going to read our first meeting with Primrose. And I know this might be the last one, because ordinarily I'd read for half an hour, then we'd do about 20 minutes of a Q&A, then tea. Can't do the tea for you, can't do the Q&A, but I'll read a bit more. Alice did what any 25-year-old with a free afternoon would do. She went to see her mother. Or rather, she went to the pub and was in the middle of a large Pinot Grigio when her mother walked in, followed by a whole host of Nordic walkers. Primrose Valentine was never one to shy away from maternal duties. After taking one look at Alice, she ordered a bottle and joined her daughter, as did the posse of Nordic walkers and their poles, looking like a group of tourists who'd dismantled a garden fence. Alice swigged the wine like medicine, gulped hard and said, "Aren't you going to introduce me?" Primrose, in the midst of escaping from her craghopper's jacket, said, "Just give me a second, love. You know never got the hang of waterproofs. You might want to try taking your rucksack off first." "What rucksack?" Primrose looked at Alice the way only a mother can when she senses their child is making fun of them. Alice quirked an eyebrow, the lower half of her face hidden behind her glass. Primrose cocked her head to the side. She groped her body as though performing her very own security check, and stopped still, her hands on the clasp of her rucksack. Her eyes went wide for a moment before she said, "That's one of the many wonders of modern clothing. There's no weight to it. I swear I could fit 70 tins of baked beans inside and walk to Tunstall with little complaint." "Really, Mum?" "Well, maybe not Tunstall, but I get far." Free of her waterproofs, Primrose sat down across from Alice and said, "Now, how is my beautiful daughter?" Alice necked the last of her wine. "I've been sacked, Mum." "Well, I guess I'll be buying lunch then." She reached for the menus as the landlady appeared with their drinks. They remained quiet for a few minutes. The Nordic walkers talked amongst themselves as Primrose allowed the silence to build. Alice knew what she was doing. Her mother would never ask what happened in case she was being too intrusive, something that would ruin her reputation as a modern mother who allowed their child space to form their own opinions about the world. This strategy worked perfectly well when Alice was 7 and too naive to keep secrets, but as soon as she hit puberty it became a problem. When Alice broke up with her first boyfriend, Primrose didn't speak to her for 3 weeks, and even then Alice only gave in because her father offered her 20 quid. Alice would eventually tell her mother, but for now she said, "What's with the Nordic walking?" Primrose shot Alice a look of mild astonishment and said, "I think I'll have the halloumi. How about you? Because you're already a member of so many clubs and societies, does Dad ever get to see you? You've always been the same, steak and chips, no thought to the welfare of the animal as long as you've 8 ounces of prime rump in your mouth. Says the woman who can't even go for a walk without her hand around a pole. I'll have you know there are 2. Alice snorted. "Who's a game girl then?" They laughed, leaving the Nordic walkers to look at them somewhat stupefied. Primrose met Alice's gaze as she poured the drinks. "I'll go and order, shall I?" There was a lump in Alice's throat that she didn't want to admit to. She spent years training to be a social worker, and she'd thrown it all away because she was too impatient to properly check a web page. Alice said, "I will tell you at some point, Mum. I promise." "I don't doubt you will, Al. We're not in the business of keeping secrets." Primrose headed towards the bar to place their order. A vole of a man leant towards Alice and said, "I hope you don't mind me saying, but you and Primrose have an interesting relationship. Has it always been like that?" "Was this the first session?" Alice asked. "Well, not exactly. There are taster sessions and training sessions before they'll even let you join the walks." "That's interesting." "It is? Yes. You see, my mother has so many different classes on the go. I'm surprised she stuck with it so long." "That's Nordic walking for you. It gets you out into the countryside and then you have the poles. Well, that's just like a full body workout, which you appreciate after 67, I can tell you. And we usually stop at the pub afterwards, supported a local business and all that." Alice hadn't expected the man to stop chatting. He was definitely more of a rambler than a walker. She allowed his words to sink in before saying, "And you are?" They shook hands. His handshake was as limp as a dead haddock as he said, "Arnold, I'm the group's leader." "Oh, leave off, Arnie. She's young enough to be your granddaughter," one of the women called. "Great-granddaughter in this day and age," said another. "You're not wrong there, Eunice," said the first. "Our Chardonnay says there's a girl in her class expecting a child at the same time as a grandmother." Alice gulped back some more wine to silence herself. She knew the case, had been involved at some point, and despite some lack of education in the merits of condoms, they were a good family. She'd always hated how quick the public were to make judgments about private lives, and although she knew they came from a place of ignorance rather than intolerance, she always found it difficult to hold her tongue. Primrose returned to the table as the walkers began to talk amongst themselves again. "I forgot to say, it's your Auntie Magdalena's will reading tomorrow. Will you be there?" Alice's eyes bloomed in their sockets. "How come you're only telling me now?" Primrose shrugged. "You must have known this weeks ago." "I did," said Primrose, elongating the words so that she sounded like a winding down of an air raid siren. "I meant to tell you, Alice, but it kept slipping my mind." "Why didn't Dad tell me? She's his auntie." "You know what your father's like. Ever since he got the new helmet cam, he's thought of nothing else. Sometimes I think he'd have paid me more attention if I'd been a bike." "No doubt he would." Once more they erupted with laughter, earning looks from the walkers. Alice didn't blame them. Even she didn't feel too much like laughing. She was 25, jobless, and living with her parents. She'd become the type of person the Daily Mirror warned against. She almost considered buying a badge that proclaimed her a millennial and making the best out of a bad job. Soon after, their food arrived. Apparently the Nordic walkers hadn't got the message that Primrose and Alice would be dining, and had no choice but to watch them eat, marvelling at the way that Alice, a relatively slim woman by anyone's standards, could attack a steak. Arnold even went so far as to comment that she looked like a lioness devouring a buffalo. When she offered him an onion ring, he soon shut up. With lunch finished, Alice and Primrose left. Rather, Alice's father came to pick them up as they become so inebriated their breath would likely boil the tarmac on the roads. Norman Valentine had seen his wife and daughter in worse situations, and as he followed the familiar routine of lifting and packing, he wondered just why all the women in his family were completely off their trees. And that is the end of that. I hope you have enjoyed this last half hour or so of me reading to you from An Heir to Murder. If you wish to support an indie author and someone who's currently furloughed, then you wouldn't go wrong to buying my book. There are always links in the description, and I'm rather proud of this book. And, you know, some other people have been very supportive of it in this community, and I'm still incredibly grateful to them. If you have any questions about this book, then please feel free to leave them in the comments below. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and until next time, that is all.